He was a certified genius, a doctor of science. He was a patriot, a general, and the inspector general of an entire empire's army. He was a brilliant inventor who held patents for the very weapons designed to make his nation invincible. He was a prince, a multi-millionaire, and the head of one of the wealthiest families in Europe. Yet this same man died stateless, penniless, and in poverty. He was legally branded a parasite and an enemy of the state, his citizenship revoked and his entire fortune seized by the very government he had dedicated his life to protecting. His name was Archduke Leopold Salvator. How does a man who builds an empire's shield end up a broken refugee, erased by the nation he tried to save? That doom was inevitable. Leopold was born into the Austro-Hungarian Empire, a sprawling prison of nations, held together by a single aging man, Emperor Franz Joseph. It was an empire of waltzes and polished brass, living in a glorious, deliberate denial of the future. Nowhere was this denial more dangerous than in the army. The generals were aristocrats preparing for the Battle of Waterloo in the age of the machine gun. They believed in courage and sabers. The world was building steel cannons and rapid-fire artillery. They were bringing a gilded carriage to a tank fight. And into this rigid, suicidal complacency, Leopold Salvator was born. He was a Habsburg, but he was different. This was the core suicidal problem of the empire. Its leadership was living in a fantasy. They were bringing a gilded carriage to a tank fight. And into this rigid, backward-glancing, and dangerously complacent world, Leopold Salvator was born. He was a Habsburg, yes, but he was different. He was from the Tuscan branch of the family. This was a crucial distinction. His grandfather, Leopold II, had been the Grand Duke of Tuscany, ruling over a peaceful slice of Italy. But he had been overthrown. In 1859, during the wars of Italian unification, his family was kicked out. They were forced to flee Florence and became, in essence, royal refugees, absorbed back into the main Habsburg court in Vienna. This experience mattered. The Tuscan branch of the family knew what it felt like to lose a throne. They understood, in a way the main line did not, that nothing was permanent. This perhaps gave them a different, more practical, more urgent perspective on life. They couldn't just rely on their name, and they had a strange, unaristocratic streak of brilliance. Leopold's own father, Archduke Karl Salvator, was not a typical prince. He was an inventor. He spent his time in workshops, not just ballrooms. He was a serious military technician who helped design one of the world's first practical machine guns, the mitrailleuse. So this wasn't just a random interest. Innovation, engineering, and military science were in Leopold's blood. It was the family business. Leopold inherited that gene and amplified it. He was born an archduke, but he had the mind of an engineer. Where other young nobles were content to learn waltzing and hunting, Leopold went to university. He didn't just accept an honorary degree. He earned a doctorate of science. He was fascinated by ballistics, chemistry, and physics. He joined the army in 1878, but he didn't join to wear a fancy uniform. He joined because he looked at the proud, obsolete Habsburg army and saw something terrifying. He saw the truth. He saw that his family's empire, his entire world, was being defended by a theatrical performance. He saw that the generals were dinosaurs, oblivious to the comet hurtling towards them. He saw that the empire's cannons were outdated, its tactics were suicidal, and its leadership was asleep. And in that moment, Leopold Salvator, the man with the ancient name and the modern mind, made a choice. He would not be a ceremonial prince. He would be the man who dragged this ancient empire, kicking and screaming, into the 20th century. He would save it from itself. Leopold Salvator's mission to save the empire from itself was not the hobby of a dilettante prince. It was the core obsession of his life, and it immediately set him apart from the rest of his Habsburg relatives. At the Viennese court of Emperor Franz Joseph, life was a suffocating gilded ritual. Everything was dictated by the Spanish's Hofzeremoniell, a rigid code of etiquette so ancient and complex it dictated who could speak to whom, who could sit where, and how one must bow. It was a court of appearances, of tradition, of form, over substance. The ideal Archduke was a man who looked magnificent in a uniform, could lead a waltz, and understood the impossibly intricate nuances of his own rank. Leopold was an alien in this world. He was polite. Of course, he was a Habsburg, but he was deeply, fundamentally bored by it. He was a man of substance, not form. While other archdukes were at the opera or the hunt, Leopold was in a workshop, his hands black with grease. While they practiced their parade formations, he was at a firing range, testing the velocity of a new shell design. He was the workshop prince. He was more comfortable with engineers and university professors than he was with counts and duchesses. This made him an anomaly, a strange bird in a court of peacocks. The old guard, the ancient generals he was trying to replace, looked at him with suspicion. He was a radical, a bookworm, an academic. He didn't just command, he calculated, and in their minds that made him not entirely a gentleman. But Leopold didn't care. He knew he was right. He pushed forward, earning promotion after promotion, not because of his name, though it certainly opened the door, but because of his undeniable, staggering competence. He published scholarly articles on ballistics. He took out patents. He designed a new kind of shrapnel shell. He developed improved sighting mechanisms for artillery, allowing cannons to be fired accurately over much longer distances. He understood that the next war would be won not by the bravest soldier, but by the side that could put the most steel on a target from the furthest distance away in the shortest amount of time. He was a prophet of industrial warfare, shouting his warnings into a ballroom of waltzers. But this modern man, this forward-thinking scientist, was also a man of his time and his class. And in 1889, he made a marriage that was not just a union of love, but a profound merger of ideologies. He married Infanta Blanca of Spain. This was not just a princess. Blanca was the eldest daughter of Carlos, Duke of Madrid. And Carlos was the Carlist claimant to the throne of Spain. To understand what this means, you have to understand the Carlist movement. The Carlists were not just conservatives, they were ultra-traditionalists. They were a faction in Spain who believed the throne had been stolen from their line, the legitimate line. They were royalist on a level that made other royalists look like revolutionaries. They believed in the absolute divine right of kings, the inseparable union of church and state, and the total rejection of modern ideas like democracy, liberalism, and secularism. They were, in essence, trying to preserve the world of the Crusades in the age of the steam engine. So here is the central fatal paradox of Leopold Salvator's life. His marriage was a dynastic alliance of two of the most proudly archaic, traditionalist, and inflexible families on earth. His wife's family motto was God, Country, King. They were ideologically incapable of compromise. In his home life, in his politics, and in his blood, Leopold was a man of the absolute, unchangeable past. But in his professional life, in his laboratory, and in his mind, he was a man of the radical, disruptive future. This internal contradiction defined him. He saw no conflict. In his mind, it was perfectly logical. He would use the most advanced radical tools of the future: machine guns, long-range artillery, airplanes for the sole purpose of defending the most ancient, traditionalist society in the world. He was forging a new sword to protect an old throne. He never once considered that the new sword might itself shatter the throne, or that the world he was trying to save was already too brittle to survive the very methods he was using. This new blended family, the Habsburg Lorraine-Tuscany engineer and the Bourbon-Carlist princess, began to grow. And it was a family built on this dual foundation of immense privilege and rigid principle. They would have 10 children in all: Dolores, Immaculata, Margarita, Rainer, Leopold, Maria Antonia, Anton, Assunta, Franz Josef, and Karl Pius. It was a vast, happy, and impossibly wealthy family. They were the absolute pinnacle of European society, a blend of Austrian, Tuscan, and Spanish royalty. And their life was one of splendid, unimaginable luxury. They lived literally in palaces. Their main residence in the city was the Palais Toscana. This was a colossal neoclassical building on a main thoroughfare in Vienna, a statement of power and presence. It was the headquarters of the Tuscan branch of the family, a working palace filled with art, functionaries, and the buzz of high-level imperial life. But if the Palais Toscana was their office, their home was something out of a fairy tale. In 1903, Leopold began construction on a new family seat, a country house on the hills overlooking Vienna. It was called the Schloss Wilhelminenburg. To call this a house is a joke. It was and is a staggering palace, a 270-room colossus built in the grand, sweeping Second Empire. Style, complete with towers, terraces, and 120,000 square meter parkland. It was a statement. Leopold built it not just as a home, but as a modern palace for his modern family, a place that combined the grandeur of his heritage with the latest technology. From its terraces, he and his 10 children could look down on the entire ancient city of Vienna, the capital of the empire he was working so hard to protect. While his children played in the vast gardens of the Wilhelminenburg, Leopold went to work. His rise was unstoppable. He was now a high-ranking general, and his focus had expanded. He was still obsessed with artillery, but he had become captivated by a new, world-changing invention, the airplane. Just as the old guard had scoffed at machine guns, they now laughed at the fragile, sputtering contraptions of wood and canvas that men like the Wright brothers were flying. They were toys. They were circus acts. They were useless for war. Leopold the scientist knew they were wrong. He saw immediately what an airplane was for. It was the eye of the cannon. His great insight was to link his two technological passions. The greatest problem for artillery since the dawn of time was knowing where to shoot. A cannon could fire a shell miles away, but if you couldn't see the target, you were just churning up mud. Soldiers on the ground or in observation balloons could only see so far. But an airplane could fly over the enemy. It could circle high above the battlefield, spot the hidden enemy cannons, map the trenches, and then using a new invention called the radio, it could send the exact coordinates back to its own artillery. This was revolutionary. It was the birth of modern coordinated warfare. Leopold became one of the most powerful and vocal patrons of the fledgling Austro-Hungarian Luftfahrtruppen, the Imperial and Royal Aviation troops. He championed funding, he encouraged experiments, and he brought aviators and artillery officers together, forcing them to work as a single unit. In 1913, at a major international air meet in Vienna, it was Archduke Leopold Salvator who personally escorted the ancient emperor Franz Joseph and explained to him in clear scientific terms how these toys were the future of his empire's survival. His success was total. He was at the absolute zenith of his life. In recognition of his work, his reforms, and his vision, he was given the ultimate position. He was promoted to the rank of General Oberst and named the Artillery General Inspector, the Inspector General of all artillery for the entire Austro-Hungarian Empire. It was done. He had won. The workshop prince, the academic radical, the engineer, had broken through the wall of tradition. He was now in complete command of the empire's cannons, both on the ground and in the air. He had the power, the budget, and the authority to finally implement his vision on a grand scale, to forge the army of the future he had dreamed of. The year was 1914. Leopold Salvator was 51 years old. He was at the peak of his power, wealthy beyond comprehension, with a large, beautiful family secure in their palace on the hill. His life's work had been validated. He was the man who had everything: a brilliant mind, an ancient name, a vast fortune, and a vital purpose. He was, he believed, the man who would save the Habsburg Empire. He stood on the terrace of the Wilhelminenburg, looking down at his city, the master of his world. And in a dusty provincial backwater of that same empire, in a city called Sarajevo, a young nationalist assassin named Gavrilo Princip was preparing a pistol. The great, terrible war that Leopold had been preparing for his entire life was about to begin. And it would not be the war he had imagined. It would be the war that would devour him, his family, his army, his empire, and his entire world. When the pistol shot echoed through Sarajevo in June 1914, it was the sound of a starting gun for the entire world. For Archduke Leopold Salvator, it was the sound of the laboratory door being blown open, the final exam beginning. The theoretical phase was over. The work of his entire life was now to be tested in blood and fire. The empire mobilized. In the streets of Vienna there was a surge of patriotic fervor. Young men flocked to recruitment posters, bands played, and the newspapers declared that it would all be over by Christmas. The ancient multi-ethnic empire, which had seemed so brittle, suddenly snapped together in a moment of unified purpose. It was us against the perfidious Serbs and their Russian puppet masters. Leopold, however, was not a romantic. He was a scientist. He understood, perhaps better than any man in the empire, what was about to happen. He was the man who had calculated the explosive yield of the shells, the velocity of the shrapnel, the range of the cannons. He knew that this war would not be a glorious cavalry charge. It would be a mathematical equation of slaughter. And he had written the formula. He was now, at 51 years old, the Inspector General of Artillery, and he was arguably the single most important technical mind in the empire. His war was not fought in a trench. It was fought in offices, in factories, on railway sidings, and over telegraph wires. While other generals were moving divisions on a map, Leopold was moving steel. His fight was against the crushing inertia of the Habsburg bureaucracy. He was the man responsible for the logistics of destruction. He had to ensure that millions of artillery shells of hundreds of different calibers for dozens of different cannon models were manufactured, inspected, and shipped to the right place at the right time across a collapsing railway system. He fought for resources. When a general on the Russian front demanded 100,000 more shells, Leopold had to find the steel. That meant taking it from the railroad ministry, which needed it for new tracks. He had to find the chemical precursors for the explosives, which meant fighting the agriculture ministry for nitrates. He was a master of a shadow war, a war of production quotas, factory conversions, and metallurgical formulas. And he had to do it all while placating the old guard generals, who still even now complained that his focus on artillery was ungentlemanly. and was using up resources that could have gone to new horse-drawn supply wagons. The war began, and it was immediately not the war anyone expected. The quick, decisive victory in Serbia failed. The Russian steamroller proved to be a terrifying, massive force on the Galician front. The empire bled and bled badly. Then, in 1915, the ultimate betrayal, Italy. Despite being in a triple alliance with Germany and Austria-Hungary, Italy declared war against them, seeking to carve off territory from the Habsburgs. A new front opened, a nightmarish vertical front in the Alps and along the Isonzo River. This was now a three-front war: Russia to the east, Serbia to the south, and Italy to the west. And this new war was personal. Leopold's wife, Blanca, was a Spanish Bourbon. The Italian royal house, the House of Savoy, were their dynastic rivals. This was not just a war of nations. For the Habsburgs and Bourbons, it was a family feud, a fight against usurpers. And this front, the Italian front, was a war of mountains. It was a war that would be won or lost entirely by artillery. It was Leopold Salvator's war. But as the war escalated, it stopped being an abstract, technical problem for the Archduke. It became a personal terror. Because this was not just his war, it was his family's. Leopold and Blanca had 10 children. In the Habsburg tradition, duty was paramount. The family was not to be seen hiding in their palaces while commoners died for them. The family had to be the ultimate example. The daughters, Archduchesses Dolores, Immaculata, and Margarita, left the gilded halls of the Wilhelminenburg. They put away their sheet music and their ball gowns, and they put on the plain gray uniforms of the Austrian Red Cross. These young women, raised to be queens and princesses, spent the next 4 years of their lives in field hospitals. They were not honorary nurses, they were working nurses. They emptied bedpans, cleaned infected wounds, and held the hands of horribly mutilated men who were dying from gangrene and typhus. They, the daughters, were on the receiving end of the very destruction their father was so expertly engineering. They were the ones who saw the human cost of his perfect ballistic calculations. And then there were the sons, Rainer and Leopold Jr. They were Archdukes of Austria. They were in their early 20s. There would be no safe desk job in Vienna for them. They were the sons of the Inspector General of Artillery. Their duty was clear. Both young men were commissioned as lieutenants in the Imperial and Royal Artillery. They were assigned to heavy artillery regiments, and they were sent directly to the most dangerous front, the Italian front. You must stop and imagine the agonizing internal paradox this created for Leopold Salvator. Every morning he went to his office in Vienna to manage the war, to make the cannons more lethal, to make the shells more destructive. And then every night he went home to the Palais Toscana to his wife Blanca, knowing that his own sons were on the Mincio River or in the Tyrolean mountains, standing next to the very cannons he was in charge of, while the Italian artillery, which he also knew technically was very, very good, was trying just as hard to kill them. He knew what a 150 millimeter direct hit did to a gun emplacement. He knew the statistical probability of survival in a sustained bombardment. He was, in effect, personally overseeing the war that was trying to murder his own children. The pressure on the man must have been unbearable. But in that pressure, a moment of supreme ultimate vindication emerged. It was the peak of his entire life, the one shining moment where both of his worlds, the ancient and the modern, fused into a perfect whole. It happened in 1917. By now the war was a brutal, grinding stalemate. The old emperor Franz Joseph had finally died, and a new young emperor, Karl I, had taken the throne. The armies were exhausted. But the fighting on the Italian front was as vicious as ever. Leopold's second son, Archduke Leopold Jr., was an artillery observation officer, one of the most dangerous jobs on the battlefield. His job was to be the eye his father had always championed, to go forward, spot the enemy, and direct the fire of his own battery. At the Battle of Mediazza, near Trieste, Leopold Jr.'s position came under a ferocious, sustained Italian bombardment. His men were being cut to pieces. The natural human instinct is to hide, to retreat. But Leopold Jr. did not. He stayed at his post under a rain of high explosive shells, calmly correcting the aim of his battery, calling in new targets, and directing a counterfire so effective that it helped shatter the Italian attack. He was, by all accounts, an image of impossible, aristocratic, almost casual bravery. He had not only shown courage, he had shown competence. He was his father's son. Word of this action traveled all the way up the chain of command, all the way to the new Emperor Karl, and the emperor decided that this act of bravery by this particular young man deserved the highest honor the empire could possibly bestow. Leopold Jr. was not just given a medal. He was made a Knight of the Order of the Golden Fleece. It is almost impossible for us today to understand what this meant. This was not a military cross for bravery. This was a 500-year-old chivalric order founded by the Duke of Burgundy and inherited by the Habsburgs. It was the most exclusive, most prestigious, and most sacred order of knighthood in the Catholic world. It was limited to just 50 members. Its ranks included the emperor himself, the kings of Spain, Bavaria, and Saxony. It was the absolute symbolic heart of the Habsburg dynasty's medieval crusading divine right ideology. And now Leopold Jr., the young artilleryman, was one of them. Imagine the moment for Leopold Salvator, his son, a hero, his son, a Knight of the Golden Fleece. And how did he earn it? He earned it by perfectly executing the modern artillery doctrines that he, Leopold Salvator, had spent his entire life developing. It was the ultimate justification. The modern science had been used to save the empire, and in doing so, had been rewarded with the ultimate symbol of the ancient tradition. His two worlds were one. His life's work was a success. His family was the embodiment of Habsburg duty, honor, and courage. For one brief shining moment in 1917, Leopold Salvator, standing next to his son at the induction ceremony, must have felt like he had truly saved his world. It was a total illusion, a beautiful, tragic, golden mirage, because while this medieval ceremony was taking place, the world it represented was dying. While Leopold and the emperor were celebrating this symbolic victory, the empire was disintegrating from within. The year 1917 was the year of the turnip winter. The British blockade was strangling the empire. There was no food. In Vienna, in the shadow of the palaces, people were literally starving. They were boiling turnips and eating bread made of sawdust. The factories that Leopold relied on were running out of coal. They were running out of steel. They were running out of workers. The men were dead and the women were exhausted. Shells were being produced, but the fuses were faulty. The quality was collapsing. Sabotage was rampant. And most fatally, the army itself was rotting. The prison of nations was breaking open. Leopold could design the world's best artillery, but what did it matter if the Czech soldier operating it no longer wanted to fight for his German-speaking officer? What did it matter if the Polish troops heard the Allied propaganda that promised them a new, free Poland? What did it matter if the Croat and Serb soldiers simply threw down their guns and deserted, as they were now doing by the thousands? Leopold's nightmare was coming true. He was the master of a perfect, lethal, high-technology war machine. But it had no fuel, it had no ammunition, and the men who were supposed to be operating it were now pointing their guns at each other. The final collapse came in the autumn of 1918. The German spring offensive, their last desperate gamble, had failed. The Allies, bolstered by fresh American troops, counterattacked, and the German army broke. Austria-Hungary, seeing its great protector disintegrate, followed in a matter of days. On the Italian front, at the Battle of Vittorio Veneto, the Austro-Hungarian army didn't just retreat, it dissolved. It ceased to exist. Over 300,000 men were captured, but millions simply dropped their rifles, took off their uniforms, and began the long walk home. The empire was over. On November 11, 1918, Emperor Karl I, the man who had given Leopold Jr. the Golden Fleece, renounced participation in government. He didn't abdicate, not quite, but he fled. The 600-year-old Habsburg monarchy was gone overnight. Back in Vienna, Archduke Leopold Salvator was in his office at the Palais Toscana. He was 55 years old. He was on paper still the inspector general of an army that had vanished. He was still by law an archduke of an empire that no longer existed. His cannons were silent. His factories were empty. His life's work, a 4-year inferno of steel and death, had resulted in nothing but total, absolute, catastrophic defeat. His world had not been saved. It had been annihilated. The war was over, and Leopold Salvator, the prince, the general, the inventor, was now just a man, standing in his palace, waiting for the knock on the door. The new, victorious, and angry government of the Republic of Austria was about to be born, and its first order of business would be dealing with men just like him. The knock on the door was not a literal one, at least not at first. The end of the war in November 1918 was not a clean break, but a chaotic, terrifying disintegration. For Archduke Leopold Salvator, the first few weeks were a period of profound, paralyzing unreality. He was a general with no army, a prince with no empire. The entire 600-year-old power structure he had been born to serve, the very reason for his existence, had evaporated in less than a week. Vienna, his city, became a place he no longer recognized. It was a city of ghosts and hungry revolutionaries. Red flags hung where the black and yellow imperial standard had flown. Soldiers, his soldiers, ripped the Habsburg eagle cockades from their caps and trampled them in the mud. The word Kaiser was now a curse. The word Republic was on everyone's lips. A new provisional government had been declared, made up of men Leopold had only ever known as loudmouthed, socialist critics in Parliament, men he considered traitors. He and his family were trapped in a legal and social void. They were still living in the vast Palais Toscana, but it was like living in a mausoleum. The servants were leaving, the food was scarce, there was no money as all imperial accounts were frozen, and there was fear, a very real physical fear. In Russia, just a few months earlier, the Bolsheviks had taken the Tsar and his entire family, his wife, his young son, his teenage daughters, and had murdered them in a basement, dissolving their bodies in acid. Was the same thing going to happen in Vienna? The Habsburgs were terrified. Emperor Karl had fled to his hunting lodge and then into exile in Switzerland. But Leopold, the Tuscan prince, stayed. Where could he go? This was his home. He waited, a prisoner in his own palace, as the new Republic of German Austria decided what to do with its former masters. The decision came on April 3rd, 1919. It was cold, brutal, and brilliantly effective. It was called the Habsburg Law. This law was the central pivotal betrayal that would define the rest of Leopold's life. It was a masterpiece of legal and political vengeance. It didn't, as the family had feared, call for their execution. It did something far more modern and perhaps far crueler. It presented them with a choice. The law stated two things. All members of the House of Habsburg-Lorraine were banished from Austrian territory for life. The entire dynasty was exiled. However, a loophole was offered. Any Habsburg who was willing to formally renounce membership in the house and all claims to the throne, and who declared themselves a loyal, faithful private citizen of the new republic, would be allowed to stay. But there was a catch, a devastating hidden clause. This choice exile or renunciation only applied to the people. The property was a separate matter. The law decreed that all property belonging to the Imperial house, all the funds and palaces and estates that were part of the dynasty's formal wealth, were to be confiscated by the state. But what about private property? What about the things Leopold or his wife owned personally, like the Palais Toscana or the newly built Schloss Wilhelminenburg, which he had financed himself? The law was dangerously, deliberately vague. It became a lawyer's nightmare. It seemed to imply that if you renounced your titles and stayed, you could keep your private wealth. But if you refused to renounce and were therefore exiled, the state would seize everything you owned, private or otherwise, on the grounds that you were now an enemy of the state. This piece of paper was the battlefield for Leopold's soul. It was here that his central fatal paradox, the modern scientist in the mind, the medieval loyalist in the heart, finally went to war with itself. The scientist, the pragmatist, the man who understood logistics and probabilities, must have seen the reality. The war was lost, the empire was gone, the money was gone. He had 10 children to feed. The logical, sensible thing to do was to sign the paper. It was a lie, sure. It was a humiliation. But it was just words. He could sign the paper, call himself Mr. Leopold Lorraine, and he would get to keep his palaces, his bank accounts, and his home. He could save his family from ruin. But then the other Leopold spoke. The man who had married Infanta Blanca of Spain, the daughter of the Carlist king. The man whose family motto was God, Country, King. The man whose son had just won the Order of the Golden Fleece, the Habsburg prince. For this man, the lie was not just words. It was everything. Let us imagine the scene in the Palais Toscana. The family is gathered. Leopold, 56 years old, Blanca, 51, and the 10 children. The older ones, like Rainer and Leopold Jr., were war veterans, hardened by the trenches, disillusioned and practical. The younger ones were teenagers, terrified. The debate must have been agonizing. The sons, Leopold Jr. and Rainer, saw the writing on the wall. They were soldiers. They knew what defeat looked like. They were not their father. They had not been raised in the golden age of Franz Joseph. They had been raised in the age of artillery and death. To them, the lie was a practical necessity, a form of surrender to a superior force. They argued, "Father, we must sign. It's over. We must survive." And then Blanca, the Infanta, would have spoken. She was a Bourbon. Her entire family identity was built on never surrendering, never renouncing. Her father, the Carlist claimant, had lived his entire life in exile, refusing to renounce his divine right to a throne he would never sit on. To her, renouncing your name was not a practical step. It was a mortal sin. It was an act of spiritual suicide. It was a betrayal of God, of your ancestors, of the very blood in your veins. And Leopold Salvator, the man of science, was trapped between his pragmatic sons and his unyielding wife. He was trapped between the 20th century and the 15th century. He made his choice. He sided with his wife. He sided with the past. He would not sign. He was an Archduke of Austria. His name was not a convenience. It was his identity. He had spent his life using modern science to protect the ancient order. He would not at the final moment use a modern lie to abandon it. It was a moment of supreme, tragic, and utterly self-destructive integrity. It was his fatal flaw, that unbending Habsburg Bourbon pride. The sons were horrified. This was not just a theoretical political debate. This was their home, their money, their future. This decision by their father would condemn the entire family to poverty. A schism tore the family apart right there in the palace. The sons, Rainer and Leopold Jr., made their own choice. Against their father's wishes, they broke with him. They, as individuals, would sign the paper. They would renounce their titles. They would become Mr. Lorraine. They would stay in Austria, try to get jobs, and salvage what they could. Leopold Jr. had another very powerful reason. He was in love with a local noblewoman, Baroness Dagmar von Vodniansky. It was a morganatic marriage, one not of equals, which the imperial family would never have approved. But now, as a commoner, he was free to marry the woman he loved. So the sons chose love, pragmatism, and the future. The parents, Leopold and Blanca, chose pride, principle, and the past. The new Austrian government was merciless. The moment Leopold Salvator refused to sign, the hammer fell. The deadline was set. He, his wife, and the 8 children who stayed with them were declared enemies of the Republic. They were to be expelled, and everything they owned was now forfeit. Not just the formal Habsburg funds, everything. Schloss Wilhelminenburg, confiscated. The magnificent 120,000 square meter park. The 270-room palace he had personally built, gone. Palais Toscana, confiscated. The family's art collection, the furniture, the silver, gone. All his bank accounts, frozen and seized. All his lands and estates across the former empire, seized. Even in a final bitter twist, the future royalties from his military patents. The new republic nationalized them, declaring that the inventions of a former archduke, created for the imperial army, now belonged to the state. The one source of income he might have had was cut off. In a matter of hours, with the stroke of a pen, Archduke Leopold Salvator the General, the doctor of science, one of the wealthiest men in Europe, had been rendered a stateless person, a tramp. He had no passport, no citizenship, no money, and no home. The government gave them a few days to pack. What could they take? A few suitcases per person, trunks of clothes, personal jewelry they could hide, photographic albums. Infanta Blanca, it is said, packed the family's ancient Spanish tapestries, symbols of their heritage. One of the daughters, Immaculata, a gifted pianist, packed not her jewelry, but a suitcase full of her sheet music by Mozart and Haydn. In April 1919, Leopold Salvator, Infanta Blanca, and their 8 children walked out of the Palais Toscana for the last time. They left their sons, Rainer and Leopold Jr., behind in the now hostile city, a family fractured. They took a train to the Swiss border. As they crossed the frontier, an Austrian official boarded the train and formally, ceremonially, stamped their papers with the word exiled. They were 56 and 51 years old. They had 8 children with them, and they had in their pockets almost nothing. They were refugees. Their destination was Spain, Blanca's homeland, a country they hoped would take them in. Their life of unimaginable privilege was over. A new life, a life of humiliation, poverty, and a desperate struggle for survival, was about to begin. The journey from the Swiss border to Spain was not a royal procession. It was the flight of refugees. Leopold Salvator, Infanta Blanca, and their 8 children arrived in Barcelona, the homeland of Blanca's Bourbon family. But they were not greeted as the Infanta and the Archduke. The Spanish monarchy, itself precarious, saw them as a potential embarrassment, a reminder of what could happen. They were relatives, yes, but poor, deposed, and problematic relatives. They did not move into a palace, they moved into a modest, rented house in Barcelona. The shock to the system was total. This was a family that had never known a moment without a servant. The 10 children, archdukes and archduchesses, who had been raised in the 270 room Schloss Wilhelminenburg, each with their own governesses, tutors, and valets, were now crammed together, sleeping several to a room, sharing their parents' quarters. The small human humiliations were the most painful. There are stories passed down of this period. There was the story of Archduchess Immaculata, the gifted pianist. During the chaotic escape from Vienna, one of her main trunks had been lost, the one containing her entire wardrobe, all her dresses, shoes, and personal belongings, gone. But a smaller case, also bearing her name, had arrived safely. When the family opened it, hoping for something of value, they found it contained no jewelry, no money, no silks. It was filled from top to bottom with the bound sheet music of Mozart, Haydn, and Beethoven. She had saved her music, but she had nothing to wear. It was a perfect metaphor for their new life. They had saved their culture, their titles, their idea of who they were, but they had lost all the practical means of living. They now had to learn basic survival. These women who had been trained to marry kings were now learning to sew, to mend their own clothes, to darn socks. The men who had been trained to command armies were learning to iron their own shirts. It was a humiliating daily education in poverty, but the greatest toll was psychological, and it revealed the fundamental tragic fissure in the marriage of Leopold and Blanca. They reacted to the disaster in two completely different, opposing ways. Infanta Blanca, the Bourbon, the mother of 10, became a lioness. She was the pragmatist. She saw the reality in front of her. Her children were hungry. The rent was due. Her mission was simple: survival. She was the one who had to manage the tiny amount of money they had, who had to negotiate with shopkeepers, who had to find a way to feed 12 people on nothing. She was focused relentlessly on the present. Leopold, however, was not. The scientist, the pragmatist, the engineer, that man was gone. In his place was the broken Habsburg patriarch, a man utterly destroyed by the loss of his identity. He was not worried about the present. He was obsessed in a way that bordered on madness with the symbols of the past. There is a devastating family anecdote from this time. While Blanca was frantically trying to budget for groceries, Leopold would pace the rooms of their small rented house in a state of profound agitation. What was he worried about? Not the lost palaces, not the frozen bank accounts. He was obsessed with the ribbon of his Order of the Golden Fleece. In the chaos of the escape, the formal sash, the ceremonial ribbon for his own knighthood, had been lost. To Leopold, this was not a minor detail. It was a catastrophe. He would wring his hands and repeat to his family over and over, "It was not ours to lose. It was not our personal property. It belongs to the order. We are responsible. We must find a way to replace it." He was a man floating, unmoored from reality. He was grieving a piece of cloth while his children were hungry. He was still the Inspector General, obsessed with inventory and accountability, but the inventory was for a museum of ghosts. He was incapable of processing that the order, the emperor, the empire, and the rules he had lived by were all gone. He was a man defined by his role, and his role had been abolished. How did they even survive? The irony is bitter. Their one single source of income was a trickle of royalties from Leopold's military patents. The Austrian Republic had seized his Austrian patents, but his inventions were patented internationally, and some countries, particularly Spain, still honored those rights. So, The very last dregs of their income, the money that kept them from starving, came from the inventions he had created to defend the empire that had now disowned him. His brilliant modern mind was paying the rent for the broken medieval loyalist. While the parents were trapped in this psychological drama, the family itself was dissolving. The real tragedy, the one that showed the generational rot, was the story of the sons. What happened to Leopold Jr., the war hero, the Knight of the Golden Fleece, the man who had bravely signed the renunciation to marry the woman he loved? His life in the new Republic of Austria was not what he had hoped. He was Mr. Leopold Lorraine, a commoner, but he was a commoner with a famous face, a Habsburg face. He was a former Archduke, which meant he was distrusted by everyone. The Royalists saw him as a traitor for signing. The Republicans saw him as a lingering threat, and there were no jobs for an artillery officer from a defunct army. He and his new wife, Baroness Dagmar, were struggling. So like millions of other desperate, impoverished Europeans, they did the one thing left to do. They immigrated to the United States. They arrived in New York in the 1920s, the age of jazz and boundless optimism. He was, for a moment, a media curiosity. Archduke Leopold comes to America. He tried to leverage his name. He and Dagmar moved to Hollywood, and he tried to become an actor. He got a few tiny, uncredited roles in silent films, a European noble in the background of a party scene, a living prop. But his name, the name he could not escape, brought him into contact with con men. He became entangled in one of the most infamous scandals of the decade, the Napoleon diamond necklace affair. A group of swindlers were trying to sell a worthless piece of paste jewelry to a wealthy American industrialist, claiming it was the lost necklace of Empress Marie Louise. And they used Leopold Gullible, desperate, and with a real title as their authenticator. The scheme blew up. Leopold was arrested. Stop and absorb this image. Archduke Leopold of Austria-Tuscany, Prince of Bohemia and Hungary, Knight of the Golden Fleece, hero of the Battle of Mediazza, was arrested for fraud. He was thrown into the Tombs, the notoriously filthy, violent city prison in Manhattan. He spent 12 days in a jail cell before he was bailed out. He was eventually acquitted. The court decided he was a fool, not a criminal, a dupe, who had been used by sharper crooks. But his reputation was destroyed. His name was toxic. So where did the hero end his days? The American dream for Leopold Jr. was this. He became a factory worker in Willimantic, Connecticut. He worked on an assembly line. He lived in a small worker's cottage and died in obscurity. The fall was complete, and in one final heartbreaking act of desperation from his factory town in Connecticut, Leopold Jr. sued his own mother. He filed a lawsuit against Infanta Blanca, demanding she give him a portion of the meager patent royalty money she was receiving in Spain. The family was so broken that the war hero was now trying to take food from the mouths of his own sisters. A Viennese court in charge of the case threw it out, with the judge coldly noting that just because Mr. Lorraine had mismanaged his own life, it did not give him the right to sue his impoverished mother. Back in Barcelona, Leopold Salvator grew old, and he grew obsessed. He was no longer the catatonic man grieving a ribbon. He was now a man consumed by a single burning purpose, vengeance, or, as he called it, justice. He became a legal scholar. He spent every waking hour in a library or with lawyers building a case. He was convinced, obsessed, that the Habsburger Gazettes was an illegal act of theft. It violated international law. It was expropriation without compensation. He was going to take the Republic of Austria to court, and he was going to get his palaces back. This legal battle consumed him. It was his new war. The papers he had once written on ballistics were replaced by legal briefs. He was no longer the Inspector General of Artillery, he was the Inspector General of his own lawsuit. By 1931, his health was failing. He was 67 years old, but he looked 80. The stress, the poverty, and the crushing weight of his obsessions had broken his body. But he had one last fight left. He managed to pull strings and get a special temporary visa to return to Austria. He was not allowed to return as an archduke. He was not even a citizen. He was admitted to Vienna on a technicality. He was a legal plaintiff in a case against the state. He arrived in the city of his birth for the last time. It was not a homecoming. He did not go to the Palais Toscana. He stayed in a modest lodging. He was a ghost in his own city, a frail, sick old man, shuffling between lawyers' offices, holding stacks of documents, trying to prove he was still the master of a house that was no longer his. And it was there, in the middle of this desperate, final legal fight, that his body finally gave out. On September 4th, 1931, Leopold Salvator died in Vienna. He died a stateless person. He died technically in poverty. He died in the very city whose defenses he had built, whose artillery he had commanded, whose palaces had been his birthright. He died as a plaintiff in a lawsuit that was still pending. The workshop prince, the genius engineer, the man who had tried to build an invincible future for an ancient world, died alone in a rented room, a footnote in the history he had tried to write. The story should have ended there, but it didn't, because the final, cruelest, and most unbelievable act of this tragedy was yet to come, and it was reserved for his widow. Leopold Salvator's death in Vienna in 1931 was the end of a man, but not the end of the story. It was the closing of a chapter, but the book of his family's tragedy had one final cruel epilogue left to be written. The legal battle, the great obsession of his final years, died with him. The Austrian Republic felt no need to negotiate with a dead man's estate, and the case was dismissed. The properties, the magnificent Schloss Wilhelminenburg and the Grand Palais Toscana, remained firmly in the hands of the state. The focus now shifted to his widow, Infanta Blanca. She was 63 years old, living in exile in Spain, and now officially a penniless widow. The small trickle of patent royalties that had kept the family from starvation was precarious. She was surrounded by her unmarried children, archdukes and archduchesses by name, but paupers by reality. Her daughters Dolores, Immaculata, and Margaretha were now middle-aged women. In the old world, they would have been queens or high duchesses. In the new world, they were spinster princesses, with no inheritance, no dowry, and no future. And then, the world that had destroyed them proceeded to destroy itself. The 1930s saw the rise of fascism. The Great Depression wiped out what little security they had. In Austria, a brief, brutal civil war led to a homegrown fascist dictatorship. Then, in 1938, the ultimate horror, the Anschluss. Adolf Hitler, a man who had once been a penniless, failed artist in their Vienna, returned as a conqueror. He annexed Austria into the German Reich. The Nazis loathed the Habsburgs. They saw them as a rival dynasty, a symbol of an independent Catholic Austria. One of their first acts was to reinforce the Habsburger Gesetz. They didn't just uphold the law, they made it more brutal. They seized all Habsburg property, private or otherwise, for the Reich. Any faint, lingering hope of legal recourse was not just extinguished, it was incinerated. The family was scattered again, now by a war far more total and ideological than the one Leopold had fought. Let us fast forward through the fire. The Second World War ends in 1945. Austria is in ruins, occupied by the Allies. A second republic is born, and one of its first acts is to, once again, re-ratify the Habsburg Law. The national trauma of the empire was so deep that even after everything, the new Austria still feared its long-dead masters. For Infanta Blanca, this was the end of the line. She was now 77 years old. Her home in Barcelona was gone. Her sons were scattered, some having fought on different sides, some struggling in America. She and her 3 unmarried daughters were destitute. They were old women with nowhere to go, but there was no return. The doors of Vienna remained closed to the end. Infanta Blanca spent her final years in Viareggio, Italy, living on the charity of her relatives, gazing at the sea far from the empire she had tried to uphold. And while she faded away in exile, history delivered a final violent blow to her legacy back in Vienna. The magnificent Palais Toscana, the home where she had raised 10 children, did not survive to see her end. In 1945, Allied bombs rained down on the city. The palace was shattered, its grand staircases turned to rubble, its ballrooms left open to the sky. Infanta Blanca died in Italy in 1949. She was spared the final heartbreak of seeing her home reduced to dust. The Austrian Republic didn't just confiscate their past, the war erased it entirely. And what of the palaces, the symbols of Leopold's life? The Palais Toscana, the site of their final humiliation, was badly damaged by Allied bombs in the war. It stood as a ruin for decades, a perfect metaphor for the family, and was finally torn down in the 1980s. A modern glass and steel office building stands there now. It is completely gone, but the Schloss Wilhelminenburg, the 270-room fairy tale palace on the hill, had a far darker, more disturbing second act. After the state seized it, it was sold and eventually became a municipal children's home. For decades, it housed the city's orphans and troubled youth. Then in the 21st century, a horrific scandal broke. It was revealed that for years, the children in the Wilhelminenburg were subjected to systemic, horrific physical and sexual abuse by the very staff paid to care for them. The beautiful palace Leopold built for his 10 happy children became, for a new generation of Austrians, a literal house of horrors. Today it has been scrubbed clean. It is a 4-star luxury hotel. You can book a room there and have champagne on the terrace where Leopold once stood, and have no idea of the double tragedy that soaked its walls. Leopold Salvator's life had ended. His story, however, was just truly beginning. His story was not just a tragedy of one man. It was the story of a fatal contradiction. He was a man of the future, a scientist, a brilliant engineer who saw the new world of technology coming. But he was chained by blood and by pride to an ancient, inflexible code. His wife's family, the Carlists, had a motto: sin Dios, nada; sin rey, nada. Without God, nothing. Without the king, nothing. Leopold's fatal flaw was that he believed it. He was a modern man who chose to die for a medieval idea. He could build a cannon, but he could not sign a piece of paper. He could calculate the velocity of a shell, but he could not see the simple, brutal reality in front of him. The Habsburgs who survived, like Otto von Habsburg, were the ones who did adapt. They renounced their titles. They became Mr. and Mrs. They ran for European Parliament. They became modern citizens. They did exactly what Leopold refused to do. Leopold's branch, the branch of the unbending engineer, was broken. He didn't just lose his palaces. He lost his patents, his sons, his country, and his entire future. The legacy of the inventor prince is not the airplane or the cannon. The true legacy is the ghost of his wife, an old woman clutching her rent money, standing in the hallway of a palace that was no longer hers, a final permanent tenant in the house of the past.